Hey there everyone, this is Zach here. So Mario Kart Wii has had thousands of world records set in the course of over 15 years. There are so many tracks to cover, all of which have a very unique history behind them. And looking back and watching some of these runs presents many great stories with this game. In today's video, I want to begin talking about a track that's had some of the most strategy changes over time in Mario Kart Wii, which is Toad's Factory. Various design features as well as general techniques being discovered have really shaped the track. Out of all of the ones in this game, this track really stands out. Plus, I've made several videos covering techniques with this track and have a lot of experience personally from testing it so much in the past, so it's a track I'm well versed in. It's also a fan favorite for many people in the community because of the tech behind it. In this first part, I'll be going over the beginning of this track's history, at least with what we have available, going up to the first 1 minute and 52 second time set on the track. With that explanation done, let's get on with the video. Now, unfortunately, we don't have footage of any world record runs from the first couple of weeks of this game's release. This was 2008, and many things just weren't recorded on the internet during that time. Plus, there were a lot more records being set than just these ones here from the website mkwrs.com, short for Mario Kart World Records, and really, we just know about these runs because we found evidence of them through things such as forums and various other places online from back in the day. So for now, these 4.5 seconds of improvements are left into obscurity. The first world record that we can actually watch is a 154.399 set by Frank, I'm not sure, they're French. It's probably just like France or France and it just changed the E to a K. For now, I'm just gonna call him Frank because I like how that sounds. Anyway, this time was set back on April 27th, 2008. This run I recorded myself since the data for it exists online, using software called Auto Time Trial Recorder, which lets you do this with relative ease. That way, you can watch this in HD with a speedometer and input viewer. Right away, we see Frank do something that's very strange from what people do nowadays, and that's they just hold their drift and wait to pass under these stompers, which, funnily enough, is actually slower than just going to the right of them, as you can see right here. Though, to get this to be faster, you have to get the wheelie out on the first frame after it drops on this straight, which I'll explain in a moment. Plus, the example I just showed you was driven as if it were just about perfect using today's modern driving techniques. Back then, the driving was probably slow enough to where waiting for the stompers was about even to going to the right of them with a frame-perfect re-wheelie. Afterwards, you can see that on the second turn, Frank really drags out that mini-turbo, waiting to release it until they see the sparks in the trick ramp ahead, as opposed to releasing it as soon as it's charged nowadays. You see this a lot with the early world records in general, which, remember, this was 2008. And Mario Kart Wii played very differently from the games before in the series. For example, to charge a mini-turbo in the previous games, you would have to move left to right in a drift enough times to get a mini-turbo out. Nowadays, it was a matter of holding the drift long enough for one to pop out. Plus, the introduction of wheelies made it so snaking wasn't really viable with bikes, and it was discovered right away that they were a lot faster than the karts. So you couldn't just go from, say, Double Dash to Mario Kart Wii and become a god with it instantly. It truly was a different experience, and as a result, many things that seem very obvious today were not known at all back in the day. In fact, one thing that's very well known nowadays is that holding upwards on the joystick, known as pulling down, gets you back down on the ground sooner, which, generally speaking, you want to do as being on the ground is faster than being in the air. What you see Frank do throughout the run is hold left, right, or neutral instead of down in the air. This pulling down strategy was not really known at this point. After this ramp, we see Frank wheelie down the straight and having to start a new wheelie before the second crane. If you look by the arrow, their wheelie goes from 96, then to 95, and then down to 93, slowly accelerating back up. If you drop to only 93 with Funky Kong on the Flame Runner, we refer to this as getting a chain wheelie. It's a one-frame trick that saves a lot of time if you get it. This only works if you get the wheelie out on the very next frame after it automatically cancels. In Mario Kart Wii, A wheelie will last for 180 frames, or exactly 3 seconds. If you get the wheelie out on the 181st frame, then you only lose 3 kilometers per hour of speed from your top wheelie speed, which is the best thing that can happen. I mentioned top wheelie speed specifically because if you remember, he dropped to a high 95 just before going down to 93. This is because he turned in his wheelie outside of a boost. However, the game only considers the top wheelie speed you could be at, not the speed you are currently at when the wheelie automatically cancels. If you're 1 frame too late, an additional 3 kilometers per hour will be lost from what you could have been at, dropping you to 90.6 with Funky Flame Runner. If you're 2 frames too late, you will go down to 87.6, 3 frames late, 84.6, and anything later, you're back down to 84.0, which is the speed Funky Flame Runner is at without a wheelie and no other speed boost. Getting the chain is very important as missing it costs a lot of time. After getting the chain, Frank does 1 mini turbo around both this turn and the following one ahead. But they do drag out their mini turbo for too long going for this ramp, just like on the second turn of the track. After leaving the factory, Frank uses their mushroom here to do the pond shortcut. And then, they proceed to use their second mushroom in a pretty strange spot, leaving the mud area. However, when they reach the stompers on lap 2, you can see they come down just after Frank drives past them, so they use their mushroom to be fast enough to beat them. After that, they fail to get a chain laps 2 and 3, they go around the pond on lap 2, trick on the last ramp as well, shroom over the pond lap 3, and then at the end of the lap, Frank doesn't trick off the last ramp. This is because tricking increases your airtime as opposed to not doing so. Thus, you aren't spending as much time on the ground, which again, getting lots of air isn't ideal. Plus, the trick boost is still going on entering the finish line. This increase in speed needs to offset the loss due to airtime, which it doesn't on lap 3. Though interestingly enough, in an ideal situation, tricking doesn't save any time compared to not doing so since the increase in airtime due to a trick is so much. However, it requires a chain wheelie without a trick for this to happen, else tricking is objectively faster. I'm seeing a trend where things were done possibly to avoid dealing with chains, like going under the stompers lap 1, which makes sense because it adds more inconsistency due to otherwise having to deal with a frame-perfect input. And a few days later, Frank improved their run again with a 3.50. Nothing really changed strategy-wise other than setting a faster time. So yeah, that's what the world record looked like at this stage. There was quite a bit of creativity with strategies at this point, such as opting to wait for the stompers lap 1, and using the second mushroom to outpace them lap 2. In fact, this variation in mushroom strategy you'll see throughout the course of Toad's Factory history, as the stompers play a huge role on what you can and can't do. For the next month, we don't have any video footage of how the track improved, other than seeing that Frank achieved the first 153, and another player named Yavi Aaron entered the scene. So I'll jump on ahead to when I can provide video footage, which is this run set by Frank back on June 3rd with a time of 153.420, insert funny wee joke here. This run I couldn't record myself since the data for it doesn't exist online as far as we know, so you'll have to watch this lower quality version from YouTube. Now there are quite a few strategy changes from their last scene run. For starters, Frank's driving has improved considerably in the past month. While they were dragging their mini turbos out for a long time before, they're now releasing them once their bike is facing the turn, allowing them to get the wheelie out sooner. They've also gotten better at getting their wheelies out and are turning less outside of a boost, which they were doing a lot of before, such as in this example right here, where you can see the speed loss by the arrow. In addition, Frank is tricking off this ramp on lap 1 now, since they're fast enough to clear the stompers lap 2 without burning an extra mushroom, and opting to use them over the pond all 3 laps. Plus, Frank is going off the side of the ramp lap 3, as opposed to off the middle of it because this gets you back on the ground sooner. They're also pulling down in the air now, which you can see by the way Funky's bike is tilting, facing more downward. There are also some minor things, such as waiting to release the mini turbo on the second conveyor belt set until you reach the end of it. The reason for this is because of 2 factors. 1. They speed you up to at least around 115 kilometers per hour, as shown by these two metrics XYZ and XZ velocity. In 2, the natural speed cap in this game's driving is generally 120 kilometers per hour, barring some exceptions such as the bullet bill item or cannons. So if you are supposed to exceed 120 kilometers per hour, the game stops you from doing so. Thus, if you release the mini turbo on the conveyor belt, you'd only be gaining a few extra kilometers per hour of speed. Meanwhile, if you wait to release it until when you get off the conveyor belt, you're going over 113 versus 96.6 with Funky Kong on the Flame Runner. So it makes more of a difference speed-wise to hold it to gain an over 12 kilometers per hour advantage for longer versus one that's only 5. Now something I do want to point out, if you've noticed, the speedometer doesn't work correctly for the conveyor belts when I record via Auto TT recorder, staying at 84 kilometers per hour. And that's because it uses the game's internal value for speed, which doesn't consider the extra speed from conveyor belts. The XZ and XYZ speedometers were developed by this game's modding scene to manually calculate this velocity. Plus, the internal value is what people generally use when recording runs anyway, even up to this point, as it was the standard for a long time. So when showing off runs, I'll be using the footage from Auto TT Recorder to make gathering footage for me easier, and then I'll substitute in other footage when necessary. But in some cases, we'll just have to use whatever footage exists online already. Now this was the last record Frank set in this game, so we'll have to bid farewell to them in their name that I probably butchered. A few days later, Yavi Aaron ends up taking the world record back with a 153.390. Nothing notable has really changed, except for one thing. On lap 3, Yavi Aaron charges 2 mini turbos on this turn as opposed to 1. Probably because he was so far over to the left that there was easily enough room to release a mini turbo and charge another one. Now this record lasted for quite a while, almost 2 months actually. It wasn't until August 5th that another player named Sayuto improved the world record with a 153.122. Just like how Yaviaron added a second mini turbo to this turn lap 3, Sayuto added it to lap 2 as well. Plus, they took this turn much better than Yavarian did lap 3, even getting something called a slip drift out. More on that in the next part of this series. A month and a half later, another player named Alvin came in and got a 042, this time adding the double mini turbo to lap 1. So as of now, all 3 laps do 2 mini turbos on this turn. Now there's another strategy change Alvin implemented on this track as well, and it's hard to notice unless you look for it carefully. You see, when you hop in the air, you can start turning at any point while doing so, and still get the mini turbo out. This means you can turn as soon as you hop, or just before you touch the ground. What Alvin does is on some turns, he begins turning just before he touches the ground. By doing so, he gives himself more room to charge mini turbos because he's not facing as far to the right or left. Thus, it takes more time for him to face that way, so you can have a mini turbo that's fully charged sooner into the turn. This helps with the double mini turbo, for example. By using this strategy, he can get the first mini turbo out sooner on the turn, release it to get an additional speed boost, then charge a second mini turbo, and release it while being on a good line to the conveyor belt ahead. He also uses this on the first turn of the track as well. This is because Flame Runner's drift is pretty good, so if you hopped and turned at the same time, you'd be facing quite a bit to the right on a 90-degree angle turn like this once the mini turbo sparks appear, and thus have to spend more time adjusting your line to be faced properly to the conveyor belt. This also means you spend less time in a wheelie. We call this strategy delayed drifting, and it's one that's used on every single track in this game. Meanwhile, on turns such as the last one on the factory section, he turns and hops at the same time. That's because he has to drag out the mini turbo anyway, so if you did the delayed drifting strategy, you'd have to hop sooner, and thus spend less time in a wheelie before entering the turn. Doing this method of starting a drift is referred to either as instant drifting or '08 drifting, standing for 2008. Basically a joke on how everyone was starting their drifts wrong every other time initially. When it comes to charging mini turbos, you do delayed drifting if you need to get it out quickly and need the space to do so, and you do '08 drifting if you need to drag out your drift anyway. With all these improvements to the track, A couple days later, on September 21st, 2008, Alvin secured the first ever 152 on Toad's Factory. For this stage of the game, the driving was pretty solid. He took every turn relatively tight, got wheelies out after he landed from all the tricks, and at least seems to have gotten a chain wheelie lap 1. He even had a very good pond shortcut lap 1 as it was very low to the water. He also describes his lap 2 as godly in the description of his YouTube video. Though on lap 3, he did something quite interesting. He swerves to the left after landing from the first ramp. In the description, he said this is because he'd hit the boxes ahead otherwise. This ended up slowing him down for lap 3, so he needed to drive good enough to get the sub. So congratulations to Alvin on achieving the first ever 152. This truly was a remarkable run. So for now, that's where I'll leave things off. While I only covered the first few months here of this track's world record history, there was a lot to explain about its general mechanics, and because these runs were set so early in this game's lifespan, strategies were constantly changing on here. Toad's Factory has had some of the most changes in strategy throughout the years due to the game evolving so much to where the track could implement faster techniques, and most notably, the stompers at the start of the lap greatly affecting what you need to do depending on your pace in a run. In the next part, I'll be covering the next second of improvements that occurred on the track, so if you want to watch it as soon as it comes out, be sure to subscribe to the channel. In addition, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a like as well. I also have a Twitter, not calling it one stupid letter, and a Twitch channel if you want to follow me there. Links will be in the description. Thank you so much for watching everyone and have a fantastic day.